So welcome to the virtual Venture Cafe, everyone. This is our annual BioConnect conference, and I would like to welcome our first-time community members as well. Before I hand over the session to our presenters, please remember to ask any questions you may have in chat. You can send them directly to the presenters if you would like to keep your identity private, or feel free to share them with everyone so everyone can see. And with this, I would like to introduce Dr. Sean Fu, who will be moderating the discussion. Dr. Sean Fu is the president of Luye US R&D. Prior to joining Luye, Dr. Fu was the president of CurePort, and before that, he worked at Merck & Co. for 15 years with a wide range of responsibilities covering R&D, business development, finance, and operational management. He earned his PhD from the Ohio State University and his MBA from the Wharton School of Business. And joining Sean Fu today is our keynote speaker, Dan Gebremedhin, who is the partner at Flare Capital Partners. Prior to joining Flare Capital, Dan served as a medical director at the Harvard Pilgrim Health Plan. He spent over 8 years as practicing internal medicine physician at the Massachusetts General Hospital and instructor in medicine at Harvard Medical School. After completing internal medicine residency at the Massachusetts General Hospital in 2010. Welcome, Sean. Welcome, Dan. Over to you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Julia. And I guess I'll start. And I just wanted to start out by saying that thank you. Thanks for the organizer, the opportunity to join this wonderful event and the opportunity to talk about this important topic with Dan. I guess I would maybe start with a few questions to Dan and to get the conversation going. And I understand there will be opportunities for audience to participate later on. So Dan, we heard the introduction, but it might be good for us to know you professionally a little bit more. And just tell us, what is your job? What kind of business deals that you're working on? What's your day-to-day life feels like?
Yeah, thank you, Sean, and thank you for the organizers. It's great to be here. So I'm a partner at Flare Capital. Flare Capital is a Boston-based venture capital firm that only invests in healthcare software and services, so health IT, tech-enabled services, digital health. We launched our fund in 2015. Our first fund was a $200 million fund. Second fund was a $255 million fund. Most of our capital actually was raised from large healthcare corporations, some of the largest payers, providers, and vertical industry players in the country. We're early stage investors. When you think about venture-backed businesses, oftentimes I'd say 80% of the deals that we're looking at are going to be Series A stage, Series B stage. Sometimes we'll go earlier, invest in seed stage companies, that are completely pre-revenue and still a concept. And sometimes we'll go later in more established businesses in special circumstances. But kind of based on the fund structure, we're very focused on how early stage companies can improve overall healthcare quality and outcomes, reduce overall costs, and increase patient satisfaction and engagement through the use of technology as well as some services.
Sounds very exciting. And so we're talking about diversity today, and Dan, it's you're in a position of the industry to exert your influence and make business decisions, therefore influence other people's career. And I was wondering, how did you get to this point? What is your professional journey prior to this point, and especially as a minority professional? How does it look, and how did it feel?
Yeah, no, appreciate the question, Sean. In finance, which is the industry I find myself in now, was not, kind of a preordained path. I kind of wound up in finance. I've been in finance for about 5 years now. And I immediately joined the finance world through an operating role. I was an operator at the Harvard Pilgrim Health Plan. I was a junior executive, and I held that role for about 2 years. Prior to that, I was an entrepreneur. I was a physician. And after my residency medical training, I went to Harvard Business School. And so that's kind of how I transitioned into the world of business. And I would say, generally speaking, being a minority, someone, of African descent, in all of those, environments was standard. It was kind of par for the course. And I think that's the kind of the unfortunate thing for a lot of minority professionals. You start to get used to it. You become immune to it, and you learn to adapt. And so, again, I think with respect to my ability now, again, I don't have complete power, I have a little bit of authority, to make decisions that will impact and increase diversity in our overall industry. I'll be candid. I don't know that I, purposefully, practically think about always increasing diversity every time I make a business decision. I would say it's actually just a part of how I live my life. It's a part of my upbringing, my development. And so, lo and behold, my first investment out of the Flair fund, out of our first fund, was into a kidney care company called Somatis. Has kind of been in the news a lot recently. They just raised a Series C round, a $65 million Series C round. The founder and much of the management team is African American. So the CEO is African American. And when I reflect on our broader health tech industry, when I think about how many companies, venture-backed companies that are led by an African American founder, it's an extremely short list. You can count on one hand. I'd say it's probably three that top of my mind. So this is one of the three. And so when I set out to make my first investment at Flair Capital, it wasn't I want to invest in an African American founder. It was more so I want to invest in a great business. But where I might, kind of provide advice to other professionals, in management and leadership positions who want to increase diversity, you have to oftentimes take into account factors that may not necessarily be a part of your traditional selection criteria. And when I think back on this business, there may have been aspects of this business that weren't kind of right down the fairway, bread and butter, the exact deal a venture firm would want to do. For example, the company was focused on services, right? Dialysis services. When you think about a health tech venture fund, you can get really quickly turned off with a company that's focused on dialysis. But when you think about the kidney care population, those patients who have chronic kidney disease, end-stage renal disease, oftentimes disproportionately come from minority communities, oftentimes can come from underserved, sectors of the economy. And so the management team looks a lot like the population, that they're serving. And so again, bring a very unique perspective to an extremely important problem. And when I made the investment in that business back in 2018, kidney care wasn't a hot space. Fast forward 2.5 years, there are probably 5 different companies now all operating in the same market space, super excited about this opportunity. And, again, clearly I took a little bit of risk early on in investing in a company that wouldn't necessarily be right down the fairway of the traditional deals that we've done. I think, the recent press that the company's gotten, the really incredible traction that the company has gotten, I think is a testament to this concept that I think oftentimes, there's a lot of studies that have shown in business circles, diverse teams, people with diverse backgrounds, add perspective and can lead to better business decisions. So I don't know if that's helpful context.
Wow, fascinating. What you just reflected on, touched upon the diversity would lead to better serve a business needs and to better serve a sector of the society where their disease profile may be different from average, if there is such a thing as average. This is a fascinating topic. And right now, it so happens, we all notice that this is diversity, the equality amongst the different racial group is a hot topic, right? The events is driving this conversation around us. So Dan, what's your take on the current event? Could you share your perspective?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question, Sean. And we do find ourselves in an extremely trying and dynamic time for a number of reasons, not just the conversations around, social justice and racial disparities, but then also, the COVID-19 pandemic, which you could argue maybe exacerbates, the current conversation around social justice. So it's a topic that I know a lot of firms have been talking about. We've been talking about it in our firm. I think our firm has been pretty vocal about how they feel and their support for this conversation, in particular for the Black communities that are kind of speaking out, not just about one incident, right? It is, decades, unfortunately, of incidents. But I think that there is a broader conversation happening now about, overall disparities between, ethnically, underrepresented groups is how I might describe it. And the conversation has become quite far-reaching. And I think when you try to boil the ocean, or swallow the elephant all at once, it can be really, really challenging, right? It can be, at the same time inspiring, but at the same time confusing, because there's so many ways to attack an extremely large problem. I think what I've reflected on is, as a person of color, this concept of, social injustice, the concept of disparities is nothing new. As I flagged before earlier, unfortunately, you become immune to it, you become used to it, you learn to adapt. Whereas I know a number of other people in, the broader, kind of professional community are just now being awoken to, I think these very, very important issues. And so, one, kind of tangible thing that I've noticed is that the fact that we're having these conversations, right? I think prior to our current moment in time, I don't know that conversations around race, conversations around disparities, conversations around social injustice, prejudice were okay to have in a professional setting. And now we are having those conversations, which are extremely important at the very least. If we are able to continue to have these conversations over time, we're more primed and aware of social injustice, not just in the broader community, but then also in professional settings. If we can continue to comment on these things, I think that's just, again, at the very least, that's a positive. In terms of, increasing diversity, reducing disparities, at the professional ranks, again, it's something that, I've been, party to on the way up. I've been a participant of several, what I would call pipeline programs that try to expose opportunities for professional advancement to underrepresented groups. And again, I've always been a fan of those. I think that overall, an individual's opportunities are limited by their exposure. If they're not exposed to certain career trajectories, certain opportunities, they're never going to make those things a priority. They're not going to make them a goal, and they're not going to work backwards to try and do all the necessary prerequisites and to prepare yourself for those things. I know that for me was the case. Finance in the world of venture capital never crossed, my awareness threshold for the first, call it 28 years of my life. It wasn't until I went to business school and, had a startup did I realize that, wow, venture capital is actually an industry and a career path that actually might suit my talents, my capabilities uniquely. And so, I would encourage, professional groups, people, in leadership positions to try to kind of reach, back a little bit earlier, in their, recruiting cycles and the development cycles, to create these quasi pipeline programs or to participate in pipeline programs to give people who have already shown a high capability, high capacity for good work to get more experience and see what is required in order to advance themselves. And then finally, the last thing I'll say is I honestly believe that promoting people who have done well just creates this natural propagation effect where people now of color who had once aspired to venture capital but never saw anybody in those positions that looked like them, myself and so the few number of my colleagues of African descent, Black Americans, who are in the some leadership positions within venture firms, now there's someone that looks like them, right? And that naturally kind of gives them a certain amount of awareness and belief that they also have what it takes as well. Yeah.
And I, from my experience, my 20 years in the industry, really witnessed some of the things you just mentioned. Is that the minorities started to take on more and more visible roles in leadership positions. But when you look at the absolute numbers, when you look at the percentage, it's still extremely low. I remember I was at the bio meeting and I was waiting for someone to have a business conversation. And as I was waiting, I noticed all the people coming by, and the profile are extremely homogeneous, very, very homogeneous. At the moment I realized, gosh, diversity is just a concept in our community. It's really not a reality. And then coming back to your experience, Dan, think about, if you're as a leader, think about the diversity of an organization and try to promote it, try to support it. One of the things we struggle a bit is, what exactly is diversity? We talk about it all the time, and you see it used in the media, and I would say we probably mean different things when we talk about diversity under different contexts. And it'll be helpful, I think, to share what exactly does diversity look like. And furthermore, some people would argue that diversity, if it simply means different skin color around the table, different hairstyles or sexual orientations in our organization, does that bring business value? In the end of the day, why we want a diversity based on the definition of diversity? Could you share some of your thoughts along those lines?
Yeah, no, it's a really great commentary, Sean. What is diversity? I agree. Oftentimes it does mean different things to different people. I think in the current time, I think we're spending a lot of time talking about, kind of ethnic diversity in terms of backgrounds. Gender diversity has been also kind of, I think, at the forefront of the national conversation. Diversity around sexual orientation, again, also is definitely bubbling up in terms of being a part of the national conversation. And candidly, I would argue that it's really, from a business perspective, it's just a diverse point of view, right? It's a different perspective. Having different perspectives around the table that oftentimes I think are rooted in someone's ethnic background, someone's gender background, someone's sexual orientation background. And again, a ton of studies. I was just looking at one that was published by Bloomberg not too long ago. That suggested that diverse teams, 87% of the time make better decisions, either than an individual or than a homogeneous group. And again, I tie it back to something that I talked a little about earlier. That your opportunity or your success, I think, is going to be directly correlated to the number of opportunities that you're exposed to and the opportunities that you have that you consider. And again, I think that when you have very homogeneous points of view, that oftentimes tend to stem from a very personal makeup, demographic makeup, but then also educational backgrounds, right? Professional backgrounds. These people tend to have gone through all the same steps at different times, but there's been a very defined pipeline, if you will, to reuse a term that I had described before, that leads a common way of thinking. And I know in some of the prep conversations we were talking about the finance industry, and in particular venture capital, private equity, and how we make decisions. We tend to be very consensus driven, and it can be a challenge sometimes in a very consensus driven culture to speak up, and to be, in some ways, kind of iconoclastic or contrarian, right, in your point of view. Oftentimes in the venture capital space, it's been documented that there's a very strong groupthink phenomenon, that, the kind of wisdom of the crowds, we all kind of tend to do the same thing. And so, when you're coming up against that wave of sentiment, it can be very challenging if you have a different perspective. And so, I would argue that it's not enough just to have diverse teams, right? You also have to empower those people with different perspectives to speak up, to share their perspective. And that hopefully, right, if you have a good business culture, those individuals, won't be, set aside as outcasts, as quote unquote difficult, if you will, right? Oftentimes is a term that you hear a lot about. but can present their perspective in a safe way. And then, extremely rational people in a group setting can decide, what is the best path going forward.
Yeah, wonderful. And this is such a provocative topic. And, the thing you mentioned, it made me started to think about things differently. One is diversity, and the other one is difference. And I think you just made a distinction between the two concepts. To me, diversity is far more proactive. It implies equality, implies participation, contribution from different perspectives. If you have that, your business decision by definition will be more balanced, well-informed, as opposed to simply different. But if there is a strong, use your words, consensus-driven cultural, then the differences doesn't necessarily translate to diversified input. Fascinating stuff. Then I want to share another experience, and I relate that to a question, is when I work in Merck & Company, and I was put on the initiative when Merck bought sharing. So I was on the integration team. And it was a wonderful experience. I was very excited. The first team meeting, I walked in there. I was the only Asian face around the table, and it was a moment of reckoning. I was like, okay, and the need, the urge to conform is tremendous. So I'm sure you have similar experiences as well as an individual of color and a minority. Now, if we think from the perspective of a professional, young professional, minority professional, what advice, Dan, you would give to someone that just start to realize that their identity it could play a role in their career path, and what are the things they should be keeping in mind, and what advice would you have for them?
It's a good question, Sean, and I mean, it's so hard to give generalized advice for a broader population, right? I can only really kind of speak from my own personal experience and kind of perspective. And again, I flagged it earlier in our conversation that as a minority professional, and I would even argue it's not just in the professional, it's even in education, right? Again, I grew up in San Diego, California, went to University of California, San Diego. And, I think we had a Black population of around 3% at that university. I then had the unique experience in medical school. I went to a historically Black medical college, Morehouse School of Medicine, where, kind of people of African descent were actually the majority. Then I went and I did my medical training at Mass General, and then I was back down to the minority again. So I've been on both sides of the minority majority swing, and I can understand how it feels to be one member of a population trying to focus on an important goal, a set of objectives, irregardless of the feelings of being different, as you kind of flagged earlier, right? So it's a lot to manage mentally and emotionally. And so I might flag that at the top, that it's okay to feel, in sometimes alienated, to sometimes feel as a bit of an outsider. Where I would caution them is to take that next step, unfortunately, that sometimes happen in that thought progression, that you now don't belong, or this concept of imposter syndrome. I would really caution people to, let these emotions, kind of overcome them in some ways, to the point where they feel like they don't have just enough right, or don't have, similar chances for success as their, majority peers. And so, again, so much of this is internal. It's internal dialogue. It's an internal feeling, but it is manifested, I think, in real ways. And so I think that would be the first thing I would say is, never let, the fact that you may not look like your counterparts as a reason why you can't be just as successful, if not more successful, candidly. And then going forward, for me personally, I can understand the desire to have mentors, advisors, kind of sponsors, people that, look out for you and help you along to look like you, right? To have your same ethnic background, your gender background, your ideological background, even to that matter. Oftentimes, I think, that would be nice. I don't know that it's a must-have, candidly. When I think about the people who have mentored me, who've advised me, who have allowed me to kind of get to the next level, do not look like me. Candidly, there's not a lot of those people. Again, that by no means does that make you, a sellout, to use the common parlance. It's about learning what it takes. But then again, I think I've tried to do a nice job of, kind of paying it forward, being a mentor, being an advisor for, a number of people of color, and trying to kind of give them, for lack of a better phrase, the hack codes. How do you kind of get ahead? What are the right things to do at the right times? And candidly, that's, what I would think about when I think about, why are there not more people of color in, kind of higher professional settings and leadership settings within different, verticals and sectors. Of course, there are a lot of socioeconomic reasons why that is, absolutely. I would say another aspect of that is, oftentimes in certain communities, I flagged the fact that I ended up in venture capital. I didn't plan to be in venture capital. But when I look at a lot of my peer groups, there was these defined set of experiences they had in order to get into venture capital. And again, I wasn't exposed to that. I didn't know what the right steps were in order to kind of get ahead. But, I think now that I have been in the industry, I'm passing those along, I think, to people of color. And so, again, I flagged pipeline programs before as just one mechanism that I think, populations that historically that have not been exposed to the inside baseball, how do I get ahead, can get access to that information. And I think if we can kind of do this in a systemized, way, I think that could make a really, really big impact. And you will start to see more diversity in leadership ranks for sure.
Yeah, a lot to do with the company's culture, how much promotion you do, how big a latitude you allow in terms of differences, and how open-minded the leadership team is, and plays into all of this. And we do have several questions here from the audience. I would encourage our participants and attendees here to raise your questions. And here's one from Rachel Ryan, and she asks us, how does Flare look at diversity in their portfolio companies?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. So, again, every company is going to be different, right? So over the life of the two funds, we've invested in probably 25 or so companies. We're minority investors. Ironically, it's a conflation of terms. We own somewhere between 10 and 20% of the company, amongst a lot of other different owners, as well as the management team. And so, we sit on the board. We will provide guidance, governance, advice to our companies. And so, again, we don't have a heavy-handed approach, I think, to promoting, diversity in our companies, but we certainly encourage our teams to, consider diverse candidates every time they go out to search for recruiting. They actually go out to recruit for executive hires. And so that's just one way that I think, we can influence our companies. Another thing that I've seen that I think has been quite powerful in some of our companies, and, I think, we're kind of working through, how can Flare do a better job in promoting diversity broadly in our industry, is just doing a simple inventory. Have a simple dashboard to what are the rates of underrepresented minorities, in our current population today? What are the rates of, kind of gender diversity, within our current population today? And I think sometimes companies don't even know that, right? And just by making that a part of a standard, board conversation on a quarterly basis, when you do the board meetings, you have a set of team slides and you just document what the diversity is. And I think sometimes when people see that for the first time, and they continue to see it, I think it almost becomes like a call to action. But I'd say that those are at the highest level, I think, how we think about it. But again, I think we increasingly, want to spend time with, diverse founders, to, kind of hear about their business ideas. And, I think over time, maybe we'll start to kind of think about codifying that and, kind of setting certain limits. in terms of, how many, women founders we want to hear from, how many, people of color do we want to hear from, again, having been on both sides of this argument and this issue, I go back to the fact that, we are venture capitalists, right? We have a fiduciary duty and a mandate to return capital at an attractive multiple to our investors, right? So at the end of the day, it's going to be business decisions that drive, our hiring, our investment decisions. And so what I always love to do is try to find, an overlap between those two, that, you have a diverse founder who, for whatever reason, may need a little bit of, may need a little help to portray their business or make a few, kind of tactical and strategic decisions to get it to a point where, hey, it has really the opportunity and the potential, if you will, to have a very, very attractive return profile. And then at that point, you don't need to sell the diversity story. People just want to invest in this great company. And so again, like I said, I flagged that, our investment in Somatis is a great example of, their Series C round was oversubscribed. Too many people wanted to invest in the company. But it's an extremely diverse team that I think when we invested in the Series B, just needed a few strategic and tactical, tips here and there. A lot of it came from the team, but I think we were helpful as well. So, I think that's just one, illustrative story.
Yeah, and just follow on that. I think you said it multiple times. Comes down to me, it's leadership in the organization. It's a demonstration of the leadership that from the highest level in the organization. And I found different organizations at a different point of the maturation curve in a way. For example, some of the leaders would say, diversity is the right thing to say. And they have the awareness. Others would say diversity is the right thing to do, which is at a completely different level. Now, if we can talk about leadership a little bit more, is you have the vantage point of seeing many, many different companies, small and some bigger. What are the best practices that you can share? Say these things really helped, at organizational level. We talk about individual level a little bit. What is the organizational level thing that we could think about implementing and helping that will have an effect in long run?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And candidly, I think we're early in the development of kind of systemic diversity across these organizations. One thing that I've seen at much larger companies is candidly you need to have a pretty big org chart. At least historically for me to have seen these types of roles, but you'll have a chief diversity officer, you'll have a chief inclusion officer. And again, it's these companies, these usually larger companies, kind of putting their money, I think where their mouth is, as you described it. I think you said it really, really, really nicely. That I think diversity oftentimes, as you said, is nice to say. I might say, people think it's nice to have, but it's not a must-have, right? And so, again, I think it oftentimes comes down to hiring practices. You've seen, some private equity firms adopt some sports league intervention. So the common one in the NFL is called the Rooney Rule, where every time they hire a head coach, they have to interview a minority candidate. And I have some issues with that, right? When it's a process metric, right? There's nothing said about outcomes. Are you actually hiring minority candidates? And anyway, it's a step, I think, in the right direction. But again, I would go back to grooming and developing talent, understanding what you want your leaders to look like, and then going out, to populations. And again, I'm not advocating for people to, make bad business decisions, but go out to, groups, whether it be, other companies, smaller companies, whether it be, graduate schools, undergraduate schools, and communicate what you're looking for. In your, hired talent executives, chief executives for that matter, and broadcasting that, and actually applying some resources, to ensuring that, this becomes common knowledge in fodder populations, if you will, that can, further develop those people and allow them to succeed. And I'd say, again, that's philosophical, but I believe that, the best companies, I think that's kind of what they do. They not only have people, at the executive level, that have, either documented that diversity is important, it's a part of their HR practices, but also, actually go out and try to help develop some of that talent.
Yeah. I think it has to go both ways, right? Individual, there is a set of things that will be helpful. Then from organizational perspective, you have to open the doors, you have to lay down the path for individuals to progress in a corporate and be able to achieve, the final results, is your point, and just not just the process, focus on the results as well. And there is a question related to the availability of this conversation offline. I believe this is recorded. Other participants may have similar questions. Yulia, do you want to comment on that before we resume the conversation?
Yes, absolutely. The session is being recorded and it will be available on our YouTube channel either tomorrow or early next week or by the end of next week, the latest. And I can definitely share my email address in chat. If you can't locate the recording and you are searching for it, feel free to reach out to me. But otherwise, I'm also going to share the link to our YouTube so you can find it yourself.
Great. Thank you very much. Any other questions from the audience as we continue the conversation with Dan here? I would encourage you to raise your questions or your perspectives along the way, and makes this more engaging and diversified input here as well. So Dan, I mean, back to some of the things that you mentioned earlier. For individuals, we talk about culture, we talk about the leadership, and I knew from my experience when I worked for a Merck company, I referred to my company a couple of times, not because I have a problem, to the contrary. I think Merck is wonderful in terms of promoting diversity. And in particular, right now, the CEO, Ken Frazier, is African-American descent. He's doing a wonderful job. And one of the things he mentioned was that when he grew up in South Philly, and there was actually a social current, if you will, social norm that he had to battle in order to get good grades, in order to go to good college. So I guess that raised to me a question is, from minority perspective, what are the things we should think about ourselves as a group, as a culture, that we need to improve or pay attention so that we can advance and grow as a community more readily? What's your thought?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a really good question, Sean, and appreciate you sharing the story of Ken Frazier. Again, like you said, who's a amazing role model and extremely successful CEO, regardless of his ethnic background, right? It is multifactorial and it's complicated, candidly. When you think about culture and how does culture impact professional development, professional ascent, because oftentimes people who do come from ethnically diverse backgrounds, there are corollaries and kind of connections to kind of the socioeconomic perspective as well, and the environment in which you were raised, and what the philosophy and the principles and the values, if you will, right? That sometimes individuals that come from some of these disadvantaged backgrounds have to overcome, right, in order to just kind of be on the same level playing field as the rest of their peers. super challenging and super complex. And, how do you actually impact that, right? How do you impact, the home in which someone, has been raised? And, I agree. I think, for Black African descent, populations, and again, I felt this, oftentimes, scholastic achievement is teased, right? It's kind of how you described, they'll call you the schoolboy, schoolgirl. I experienced that. It's not cool. And, again, I think that goes to culture, right? Who do you celebrate in your culture, right? And you may look at, different ethnic groups, and, different ethnic groups may celebrate different individuals, at varying strata within society. And it's challenging. I don't know how you impact that, right? Again, I think, you can kind of point to, very successful professional individuals, bringing them back into the community, highlighting them within the community. I do a lot of motivational talks for inner city high school students. I'm ethnically Ethiopian, so I also do these talks for Ethiopian populations, and I see this on a regular basis. This tension, because at the same time, the culture is right to have their role models, whatever the role models are. So how do you kind of systematically promote, as we talked about before, visions of people who have been successful professionally, and that look like people that come from their culture, right? I think that there are ways to do that. At the same time, I don't think that it's easy to be quick to, tear down whoever they're, idolizing today, because there are systematic reasons why they're idolizing these people, right? For that matter. So, again, I think I've tried to do that with a lot of these pipeline programs, a lot of motivational talks, but I agree. I've felt that undercurrent, as you described, that can sometimes kind of take away from someone's innate, natural curiosity or drive to want to better themselves.
Fascinating. And we got another question. I know we are short on time. Yulia, it's okay. We cover this one last question before we.
Absolutely.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
Minutes later, so we can definitely take every single second to answer the question.
Thank you. Himali has a question here. It says, what do you suggest for leaders to do, actually see what barriers are for different group of people? And how do you train leaders to identify the nuances?
Yeah, no, really great question. And it's a tactical one. One way that I've seen, and again, I think you always have to be sensitive when you are addressing issues of, diversity, because I don't think you ever want to dictate to someone how they're supposed to feel, right? I think sometimes, especially with the diversity conversation, and I think in our prep session, we were talking about, the current, kind of social justice phenomenon. Oftentimes people will assume that because you come from a certain background, we expect you to feel this way. You don't know. Everybody's going to be different. Everybody's experience is going to be different. So I would query these people, right? I would query whichever groups that you are looking to increase diversity of, whether it be ethnic, gender, sexual orientation, what have you. Understand their perspective first, I would say. And they'll tell you, again, if you curate a safe space where they can share their honest feelings, they will tell you within your organization. They may even name names, right? But where they see barriers to advancement, where they see barriers to increasing, the overall number of diverse people in your group. And I think if you start from this survey perspective, you can then, start to implement, some of the learnings. And again, this is a common practice. Again, I think best of breed companies, Sean, you're asking about best practices earlier. I would argue that the best of breed companies are already doing this. They are already doing employee engagement surveys on a regular basis, right? What I can't say for certain is that they have questions about diversity, right? That they have questions about where are the barriers, to increasing diversity. And so I think if you start with, established processes, if you don't have these processes, you should probably start them, understanding how do your employees feel? Is this a great place to work, et cetera, but add in some questions about diversity and start that flywheel effect of implementing these things. And then again, as we talked about earlier, just, doing, high level, demographic statistics, what percent of population do you have from these different backgrounds? But then also at the leadership ranks, how many, people, of color are above a certain leadership level, director, manager, VP, whatever, C-suite. I think those are the things that you kind of just, you start to realize once you ask the questions, right? Unfortunately, a lion in our industry, Dr. Aaron Waxman, the father of Lisa Sunan, used to say that you expect what you inspect, right? And so if you're not looking, for it, you're not asking the questions, you'll never know. And so I'd say that's probably the first step.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you so much, Dan, for sharing your insight. And thank you everyone for participating. And I'll turn the mic back to Leah.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Dan, for sharing your insights today. It was incredibly insightful, and I'm sure the audience appreciates it. And please go back to watch the first part if you missed a part of the session. I am going to share my screen for a couple of seconds. There it is. There we go. Please hover your phone over this QR code if you would like to give us feedback. Let us know what you think. It's a one-question survey. And I wanted to let you know that after this session, we have another one, and we are continuing our conference with the Fireside Chat on trends, technologies, and opportunities in biotech at 2 p.m. I shared the link in chat, and I am going to stop talking. But before I do, I wanted to say that we are closed next week. And I wish you all a happy Independence Day, and thank you for tuning in.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. Cheers.
Okay, have a wonderful rest of your day.